Cassandra Breyer had never been the kind of woman to rush decisions. Her life, carefully built over decades in manufacturing and logistics, operated on logic, timing, and discipline. So when she bought the Lakeview property tucked away in a seemingly perfect cul-de-sac, it wasn't a whim or emotional purchase, it was a calculated step into a chapter she had been preparing for over the past year. Divorced, nearing the age most people start talking about retirement, Cassandra wasn't looking to start over in the sentimental sense. She was choosing solitude, peace, and sovereignty, and for the first few weeks, it felt like the decision was paying off. The house was modest but strong in structure, designed in the 1970s and weathered just enough to feel dignified rather than outdated. Surrounded by tall trees and flanked by only a few neighbors, it overlooked the water through a soft slope of grass and rustling reeds. Cassandra had spent her first mornings waking early without alarm, taking black coffee out onto the deck, and sitting for minutes at a time in complete silence. No traffic hum, no impatient emails, no obligations except to herself and the rhythm of the wind through the branches. She had downsized with purpose, shedding the glass tower apartment and its clinical sterility for something rooted. Here she could breathe again. She liked the way this place made her feel inconsequential in a good way, as though the world would go on, regardless of whether she joined it that day or not. 3 days after moving in, she was crouching beside the porch, tightening one of the old rail bolts, when she noticed a woman standing across the lawn. Elegant in appearance and carefully styled in a way that felt performative, the woman was holding a small foil-wrapped tray and smiling, as if Cassandra had summoned her. She didn't wave, just stood until Cassandra stood up herself, dusting her palms on her jeans. "You must be Cassandra," the woman said, stepping onto the edge of the gravel path. "Karen Griffith. I live just over there." She pointed without looking. "I thought I'd welcome you. Not many people move into this part of the block. It's a bit off the beaten path, which I suppose you like." Cassandra smiled politely and took the tray. It was still warm, something baked, cinnamon maybe, and heavy with homemade confidence. "Thank you," she said, watching Karen's eyes flicker to the porch tools, then to the power washer still coiled near the sidewall. "Just cleaning up some of the weathering," Cassandra added, making conversation. Karen didn't nod or engage. She simply kept her eyes moving, as if she were taking inventory. "I always say," Karen said finally, "when someone new joins the street, it's not just about the property lines, it's about the energy they bring into the community. You strike me as quiet, and I hope I'm right. This is a quiet place. Most of us like it that way." It was phrased like a compliment, but sounded like a rule. Cassandra nodded, still with a faint smile, and gestured toward the kitchen door. "Thanks again for the welcome. It's been a long week of unpacking. I'll let you know when I get around to baking myself." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her gaze narrowed slightly before she turned and walked back across the grass. She didn't look back once. That evening, Cassandra noticed the outdoor furniture had been moved. Not all of it, just the placement. The folding chair that had been beside the side door was now at an angle near the patio wall. A potted plant was shifted to a different step. She stood still for a long minute, her brain attempting to rationalize it. Maybe she had moved it earlier in the day and forgotten, maybe the wind. But the weight of the clay pot, the precise repositioning, and the absence of any disarray told a different story. Someone had been on the property. Someone had touched things, not stolen, not vandalized, just adjusted. She reset everything carefully, mentally tracking what she'd lock and double-check in the morning. The tray Karen had given her was untouched on the kitchen counter. Cassandra had always had a strong instinct for manipulation. It was one of the reasons she had risen through the ranks in her previous career without ever being taken advantage of. She'd worked with men who masked threats in compliments and women who weaponized graciousness. Karen Griffith had the same tone, that precise, brittle friendliness that made you feel like any deviation from expectation would be seen as a personal insult. It wasn't the welcome that unsettled Cassandra, it was the calm, intentional scrutiny behind Karen's every word and gesture. She wasn't simply being neighborly. She was probing. A week later, the letter came. It arrived not through the mail but folded neatly inside the front door frame. Unmarked envelope. Inside was a typed notice, no letterhead, no logo stating that the residential committee had identified unauthorized window reinforcements on her property and that this could lead to early compliance discussion. The tone was oddly bureaucratic, yet not official. The only name referenced in the text was contact Karen G. for further guidance. There was no such committee listed in any of the welcome paperwork she'd received with the property, no registered association in her deed documentation. Cassandra took the letter, scanned it, and filed it, then called her real estate attorney the next morning. He confirmed her instinct. There was no registered neighborhood association, no entity that could issue formal citations or notices. It's possible it's an informal committee, he said. But unless they've incorporated or have bylaws filed with the county, they're just neighbors with opinions. They can't penalize you for anything. Still, she asked him to draft a general cease and desist letter to anyone attempting to enforce fictitious authority. She didn't want trouble, but she wasn't going to invite passivity either. She'd worked too long and too hard to allow petty politics or manufactured civility to dictate how she lived. Things quieted for a few days. Then the small things began again. The trash bins, which she kept aligned with the curb, were twice found dragged halfway back up the drive, never fully returned, just off position enough to imply correction. A flower bed she'd been planning to plant was suddenly dug through, the soil disturbed, and 2 of the stakes she'd left beside it missing. Not stolen. Simply gone. And then came the most disquieting change. A man parked down the road, sitting in his vehicle for close to 40 minutes without getting out. Cassandra had seen him from the window while finishing her morning routine. He wasn't watching the house, necessarily, but his presence didn't feel accidental. She logged it all, not emotionally, factually. Times, dates, locations. She kept a folder on her desktop and one on her phone. She wasn't preparing for a confrontation, she was preparing for clarity. In her experience, the most dangerous thing wasn't conflict. It was ambiguity. She had dealt with saboteurs in the workplace, passive-aggressive bureaucrats in state contracts, and rival firms who weaponized fine print to destroy reputations. The most effective way to survive was not to escalate but to document everything until the pattern exposed itself. She hadn't come here to fight, but if someone forced her into a game, she wasn't going to play it blind. Late one night, as she sat on the patio with a cup of tea, she heard the sound of soft, crunching footsteps on gravel, not on her side of the house, but out front. She stood, not panicking, and walked around through the living room to the front window. There was no one there, no car, no figure. Only the faint sense of movement in the air, the quiet aftermath of someone leaving too quickly to be seen. The wind shifted, and the chime she had installed earlier that day on the side deck jingled once, then stopped. A single note in the dark. She locked every door, then checked them again. Whatever peace she thought she had found here, it was no longer pure. And the woman who brought her the tray of bread no longer felt like a neighbor. She felt like a trigger. Cassandra didn't know yet what had driven Karen to choose her. She only knew that something had. And it wasn't about friendship. It wasn't about community. It was personal. And it had just begun. It began with silence. Not the peaceful kind Cassandra had grown to love, but a strained, hollow version of it, like the quiet that follows something broken. She had been working on a report for a consulting client, seated at the long pine kitchen table with her laptop humming and a cup of herbal tea going cold beside her elbow, when she noticed it. The usual background ambience, the soft rustle of trees, birds calling across the lake, even the distant hum of traffic far down the hill was gone. In its place was stillness, unnatural and oppressive, like the landscape was holding its breath. Cassandra stood slowly and moved to the back door, stepping out onto the deck barefoot. The air was dense, warm for late spring, but dry. Her eyes scanned the tree line, and as she stepped forward, something crunched underfoot. Looking down, she saw a small object, metallic, misshapen. It was one of the solar lights from the pathway, only the top half, its inner wiring mangled, the solar panel shattered as if it had been stomped on. She crouched, picked it up, and felt that creeping chill at the base of her spine. This hadn't been a wild animal. It had been deliberate. She walked the perimeter of her yard and quickly found the rest of the solar lights strewn along the grass, crushed or dislodged, their stakes broken or missing entirely. One of the lights had been thrown with enough force to dent the aluminum siding of her tool shed. Cassandra didn't shout. She didn't even curse. She merely walked back inside, closed the door, and pulled up the camera footage from the previous night. She had installed a security system after the third unannounced visit from Karen, the one where she stood at the bottom of the deck stairs, holding a mug and a notepad, claiming she'd accidentally walked through the wrong gate while taking a morning stroll. That was weeks ago, and Cassandra had learned to stop giving the benefit of the doubt. The footage was grainy in places but mostly clear. At 3:11 a.m., the corner of the frame flickered, and there she was, Karen, walking calmly into the backyard through the side entrance. She didn't creep or hesitate. She moved like she belonged there. Dressed in dark clothing, she moved from one solar light to the next, lifting each one, examining it briefly, then smashing it to the ground. When she reached the last one, she stood still for nearly 40 seconds, staring at the deck where Cassandra usually sat in the mornings, before turning and walking off screen. Cassandra watched it twice. Not to confirm what she saw, it was unmistakable, but to study Karen's demeanor. She wasn't angry. She wasn't manic or confused. She looked resolved, composed. Cassandra made a backup of the footage, time-stamped it, and sent it to her attorney with a brief note: new escalation. Possible criminal mischief. Let me know next steps. The police visit was uneventful. The officer, a young man who looked fresh out of academy training, politely watched the footage, took notes, and told Cassandra they'd keep it on file. When she asked whether that meant Karen would be questioned or at least warned, he hesitated. "We can issue a courtesy notice," he said. "But unless there's damage exceeding $500 or physical threat, it's considered minor property disturbance." Cassandra didn't argue. She thanked him and walked him out, locking the door as soon as he left. Then she made a private appointment with a civil litigation specialist. If the law required her to compile a threshold of offenses before action could be taken, she would do it precisely, methodically, and with surgical attention to every detail. 2 days later, she received a second note, again hand-delivered, again anonymous. This one was taped to the glass of her front storm door. It was typed, centered, and said only, "The problem is not the lights. It's you. You are the disturbance." Cassandra read it 3 times. It wasn't angry or erratic. It was calculated. The use of the word disturbance particularly caught her attention. It was the same term Karen had used in a previous rant about disruptive influences. During a neighborhood dinner that Cassandra had attended only once and vowed never to return to. A week passed with no further incidents, and Cassandra tried to reclaim her routine. She resumed her early walks, though she now carried pepper spray and a whistle and installed motion sensor lighting along the interior hallway that faced the back windows. It wasn't about fear, it was about preparation. Her father had taught her that when she was 15, never let your guard down just because the noise has stopped. It often meant something was about to begin. Then came the animal. At first glance, it looked like a dead raccoon. Cassandra had found it early one morning lying in the flower bed beneath her bedroom window. Its body was stiff, untouched by insects or decay, as though it had only just died. But when she looked closer, she saw no signs of injury, no wounds, no bite marks, no road rash. Its fur was damp in odd patches, and when she moved it gently with a gloved hand, she noticed a chemical scent, faint but present. Not gasoline, not bleach. Something artificial, acrid. She didn't move it. Instead, she called the local animal control office, who sent out a technician within the hour. The technician, a middle-aged man with a firm handshake and a no-nonsense air, examined the raccoon for a few minutes before standing and dusting his hands. It didn't die naturally, he said. Most likely poison. I can't confirm what kind without lab work, but it's fast-acting. Could have been left out in bait. Cassandra's mouth went dry. You mean someone left it here on purpose? He didn't answer directly. It didn't get here on its own, not this clean. You might want to keep your pets indoors, if you have any. She didn't. But she knew what this was. A message. She called her lawyer again and gave a full account. He responded that with the combination of property destruction, personal threats, and now potential animal poisoning, they had enough to build a civil harassment case. He advised her to file for a restraining order and that he would initiate a formal notification process within the week. Cassandra agreed but said little else. She was already planning her next move. That same evening, as dusk painted the sky in copper and violet, Cassandra walked around the side of the house to collect her mail. Among the usual circulars and bills was a small envelope, no stamp, no return address, just her name, written in block letters. She opened it carefully, suspecting nothing less than another warning. Inside was a single photograph. It showed her, seated at her kitchen table, lit only by the glow of her laptop screen. It had been taken from outside, through the rear window. She stood still for a long time, holding the photo in one hand while the envelope dangled in the other. The angle suggested the photographer had been behind the shed or near the tree line well within the bounds of her property. She had been watched, and not just generally. Someone had approached her home close enough to capture that image without triggering her cameras, meaning they knew where the blind spots were. That night, she did not sleep. She reviewed her camera angles, adjusted their coverage, and booked a consultation with a private home security firm. She contacted her lawyer again and instructed him to expedite the restraining order. She filed a separate report with the police, insisting that the evidence now pointed to a pattern not of mischief, but of stalking. And she made a third call to a retired district supervisor she had once worked with on a regulatory review. Not for protection, but for connection. Someone outside the bubble, someone with clout who owed her a favor and could quietly push things if needed. The following morning, someone rang her doorbell at 6:43 a.m. Cassandra checked the video feed before answering. It was Karen. She was dressed in exercise clothes, holding a travel mug and smiling like nothing had happened. Cassandra didn't open the door. She spoke through the intercom. Please leave my property. Karen tilted her head, still smiling. You don't need to be rude, Cassandra. I was just going for a walk and thought I'd say good morning. Neighbors should be neighborly. Cassandra didn't answer. She watched Karen slowly walk back down the path, her smile unwavering until she reached the sidewalk and disappeared from view. That day, the sense of quiet that Cassandra had once cherished felt tainted. The air smelled the same, the water still sparkled in the distance, and yet everything was different. There was a predator in the woods now, not a beast of instinct, but a human being with a need for control, a desire to dominate, and a grudge that had taken shape like smoke wrapping itself into shadow. Cassandra didn't know why she had been chosen, but she was beginning to understand one terrifying truth. This wasn't random, and it wasn't going away. Not unless she made it go away, and from now on she would prepare for every visit, every message, every time the wind felt just a little too quiet. The silence that followed Karen's latest appearance was not a relief, it was the beginning of something colder, heavier. Cassandra knew by now that this was a pattern, a rhythm Karen had engineered: proximity, pressure, retreat. She would push just enough, make herself known, stir the waters, and then vanish, letting paranoia settle like fog. But Cassandra wasn't panicking. She wasn't sleeping much either, but her exhaustion sharpened her instincts rather than dulling them. She focused. She collected. She documented. She moved not with fear, but with foresight. And still, despite her vigilance, what happened next came not with violence or a bang, but through a quiet, administrative ambush. It began with the envelope. Unlike the others, this one was certified and stamped, legally filed and sent through proper channels. Cassandra opened it at her kitchen counter after wiping down the surface like she always did, her routines never breaking even under stress. Inside was a formal notification from the county zoning office. It stated that a complaint had been lodged against her property citing code violations related to her back deck extension. The letter included photos, old ones, possibly from real estate listings before she had moved in, but now marked with red circles around support beams and foundation lines. The complaint alleged unapproved construction and improper drainage solutions that could pose a neighborhood risk during storms. The notice informed her that an inspection would be scheduled within the next 10 business days, and failure to comply could lead to fines or mandatory removal. Cassandra stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, her breath steady but shallow. She had not extended the deck. She had barely touched the damn thing, apart from resealing the wood and replacing a few railings. The structure had been there when she purchased the property, and all the paperwork had passed through legal review. But someone had fed the county bad information. And someone had gone to the trouble of assembling photos, writing language that mimicked legal concern, and filing it just convincingly enough to trigger an official response. Cassandra didn't need to guess who. She spent the next 4 hours combing through her purchase records, permit approvals, and structural surveys. Then she called her lawyer and sent him everything in a single encrypted drive. He confirmed her paperwork was in order and contacted the county office on her behalf to demand that the complaint be flagged as potentially malicious and reviewed for procedural abuse. But the damage was done not in the legal sense, but in the psychological one. Cassandra knew Karen was elevating her tactics. She was moving from passive harassment to systemic interference. She was learning how to weaponize bureaucracy. The inspection was scheduled for the following Thursday. 2 men arrived in a marked city vehicle just after 9 a.m., polite but clinical. They spent 20 minutes walking the perimeter, taking photos, occasionally kneeling to check angles or soil runoff positions. Cassandra stood with them the whole time, not interrupting, answering their questions with clarity and proof in hand. She didn't mention Karen. She didn't need to. When one of the inspectors looked up from his clipboard and said, "Honestly, this structure is more sound than most of what we see. Who filed this again?" She simply said, "The complaint was anonymous. But I believe you're looking at someone's grudge, not an actual violation." He nodded, scribbled something, and said they'd file a report within 3 days. She thanked them and walked back inside, holding the door handle for a moment longer than necessary, grounding herself in the cool steel. But that evening, the next phase began. The lights. Around midnight, while reading in bed, Cassandra noticed her hallway lights flicker once, just a brief stutter, like the power had dipped for a fraction of a second. It happened again 30 minutes later. Then the exterior lights followed. At first, she thought it might be a faulty breaker, but when she checked the panel, everything was normal. It continued into the next day, intermittent flickers. Not full outages, just enough to unsettle her. She called an electrician, who inspected the wiring, checked the grid, and left with a shrug. "Your system's fine. No overload, no shorts. It's like something sending a pulse just strong enough to interrupt, but not enough to trip anything." That night, the security cameras cut out for exactly 16 minutes between 2:14 and 2:30 a.m. When the footage returned, nothing was disturbed, but one of the front porch chairs had been rotated slightly, and the welcome mat had been turned upside down. Not obvious. Not loud. Just wrong. Cassandra stood on the porch that morning, staring at the subtle disarray, and felt something tighten in her stomach, not fear, not quite, but a grim certainty that whatever Karen was building toward, she had just tested its first mechanism. Then came the letter from the power company. A formal request for verification of identity and address usage had been filed on Cassandra's account. The request included a secondary email and a forwarding address, supposedly submitted by the account holder as part of a relocation process. Cassandra had received no such notice. Her billing had not changed, but someone had initiated a verification hold on her electricity services, requiring her to appear in person to confirm her identity. It was an attempt to stall or interrupt her utilities without outright canceling them. When she asked the clerk at the counter who had submitted the request, she was told the data was protected due to privacy policy. She submitted a fraud report. She got the account unlocked. But she walked out of the building with one question rattling inside her skull: how many times could Karen do this? How many systems could she hijack before one of them believed her? By the end of the week, Cassandra was receiving text messages from unknown numbers. They weren't threats. They were questions, written in an eerily casual tone. Hey, is this the house with the cats for adoption? Or still renting out the guest room by the lake? One message simply said, saw your post on Craigslist. Still available? She hadn't posted anything. She didn't even have a Craigslist account, but someone did. And they were using her address. She took her phone to a digital security firm and asked them to run an analysis. The technician found 2 separate listings, both posted from anonymized IP addresses and traced back to public terminals: a library, a copy center. The ads included her address, listed under pet rehoming and short-term lease women only. The photos in the ad were stolen from her own home's online real estate archive. She filed a police report and had the listings taken down. But the damage was subtle and effective: sudden knocks on her door, confused strangers, one woman who tried to walk around the side of the house claiming she had a tour scheduled. It was then Cassandra understood the real danger of Karen's approach. She wasn't trying to break windows or leave obvious threats. She was trying to make Cassandra look unstable. She was manipulating public systems, public perception, and inserting just enough confusion into the environment to discredit Cassandra's ability to live peacefully. And if Cassandra snapped, if she lashed out or made a public accusation without proof, Karen would have won. So Cassandra recalibrated. She met with her attorney and began formal pre-litigation proceedings. They would build a case slowly, meticulously, and with full documentation. Every complaint, every irregularity, every contact. They would present a timeline, not a story, and they would let the pattern become undeniable. In the meantime, Cassandra began preparing for the next level of confrontation. She installed reinforced locks, created a secondary home server to store camera footage off-site, and spoke with a crisis management consultant, not because she thought she was in danger, but because she had learned that Karen's method wasn't physical, it was systemic. She could turn the world against you before ever laying a finger. And so when Cassandra received the next letter, this one an invitation to an informal mediation session regarding neighborhood cohesion and safety concerns, she didn't blink. It was clearly orchestrated. No legal authority, no relevance. Just a gathering meant to trap her in a room where anything she said could be twisted, recorded, or reframed. She declined the invitation through her attorney, citing ongoing harassment and open legal counsel. It was a quiet refusal, but it sent a loud message. Karen didn't knock again that week, but her presence lingered. Cassandra found the imprint of a palm smeared against the glass of her sunroom window. Not a full handprint, just the oily smudge where fingers had pressed and dragged. She didn't wipe it away. She took a photo, added it to the file. If Karen wanted to escalate, Cassandra was ready. But she wasn't going to fight on Karen's terms. She would fight with clarity, with structure, and with the same meticulous control that had kept her from collapsing under a dozen other storms in her life. Karen thought she was unpredictable, but Cassandra had seen her pattern. And the worst mistake a manipulator could make was assuming their target was afraid. Cassandra wasn't afraid. She was building her case. Brick by brick, day by day, and soon she would have the foundation she needed to bring it all crashing down. The official mediation was held on a drab Tuesday morning in a beige room that smelled faintly of dry carpet and burnt coffee, hosted in a community services annex across town where administrative conflicts were sent to die in quiet, bureaucratic exhaustion. Cassandra had no illusions about its effectiveness. This wasn't arbitration, it wasn't binding, and it wasn't designed to protect her. It was a formality, a checkbox on a paper trail, but her attorney insisted it would help to show that Cassandra had cooperated in good faith, especially if things continued to escalate. Karen, of course, arrived 10 minutes early. She wore a dusty pink suit jacket, too formal for the setting, paired with a silk blouse and pearls, and her hair carefully styled into the same polished helmet it had been since the first day Cassandra met her. She greeted the clerk by name, smiled at the mediator, and looked at Cassandra like one might look at a hotel guest who had overstayed their reservation. Cassandra offered no expression in return. She simply sat across from Karen at the long folding table and laid her file down with the weight of accumulated evidence. The mediator, a woman in her 50s with a voice that was probably meant to be calming but landed somewhere between weary and indifferent, opened the session with a scripted reminder that this was a voluntary process and that both parties were encouraged to participate respectfully. Karen responded immediately, leaning forward, her voice syrupy and controlled, explaining that she had only ever wanted to maintain the atmosphere of the neighborhood, that her concerns had always been rooted in safety and continuity, and that Cassandra's behavioral unpredictability and refusal to engage had unfortunately forced her to take more formal steps. Cassandra let her speak without interruption, watching the way Karen's eyes flicked toward the mediator with every rehearsed phrase, like she was waiting for approval, like she was performing for a hidden audience. When it was her turn, Cassandra spoke plainly. She outlined the incidents chronologically, provided copies of the complaints, the fraudulent ads, the tampered utility filings, and the surveillance footage that captured Karen trespassing and damaging property. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply presented facts. Karen's smile cracked slightly when Cassandra referenced the dead raccoon, and for a moment, her hands clenched in her lap, her voice slipping into something sharper as she denied any involvement. "It's absurd," she snapped, "to suggest I would poison an animal. I'm a member of the Humane Society." But the mediator, though visibly uncomfortable, didn't challenge Cassandra's documentation. Instead, she recommended the parties reconsider their relationship as neighbors and seek a path forward that preserves community stability. Karen immediately agreed, offering to cease further contact provided Cassandra respected communal norms. Cassandra, without looking up from her folder, stated that she would accept those terms under one condition: a written agreement confirming Karen would not trespass, submit false complaints, or initiate third-party contact under false pretenses. Karen refused. The meeting ended without resolution. Cassandra walked out into the parking lot and sat in her car for a moment longer than necessary, her fingers resting on the steering wheel. The sun was too bright for the hour, and she felt the stale heat of the interior baking into her spine. This wasn't about legality anymore, if it ever had been. Karen was never trying to win. She was trying to erode. And she wasn't just targeting Cassandra's property or peace of mind, she was targeting her identity, her credibility, her mental frame. It was a kind of psychological siege, not aimed at overwhelming force but at slow, sustained disruption, designed to provoke Cassandra into reacting emotionally so that any future action could be reframed as instability. It was clever, ruthless, and Cassandra wasn't going to fall into the trap. That night, she began the process of removing all personal traces from public access. She deleted outdated social media accounts, purged old blog entries, unlisted her name from residential databases, and initiated a request to redact her voter registration address. She didn't do it out of fear. She did it out of strategy. Karen was using information as a weapon, twisting fragments of Cassandra's life into leverage, and if she wanted the battlefield clear, she would take away every advantage Karen had. She also reached out to a retired municipal compliance officer she had once worked with years ago and asked a simple question: how many complaints could one person file before the city started looking at them instead of the target? He laughed, not unkindly, and said, "If it's coordinated enough, they'll eventually flag the source. They have to. Even local governments get tired of paperwork." Cassandra thanked him and ended the call, letting the silence settle around her like armor. But 2 days later, a box arrived. No return address. No markings except her name, printed in all caps across the top in block font. It had been left at the edge of her porch, not delivered by any service she could trace. Inside were dozens of printed pages, some torn, others photocopied, most of them documents she recognized, old correspondence from her previous job, HR forms, memos with her name and signature. There were also 3 photographs of her former office, including one image of her standing in the break room, her back to the camera. She had never seen that photo before. Beneath the stack was a folded note, typed and printed in black ink. Your story isn't as clean as you pretend it is. Some of us remember, some of us never forget. The implication wasn't subtle. Karen had dug into Cassandra's past, or at least fabricated enough context to imply that she had, and now she was threatening to use Cassandra's own life against her. It was a scare tactic, vague, unprovable, untraceable. But it was also a line crossed. Cassandra didn't report the box. She didn't respond. She simply photographed every item, sealed them in evidence bags, and stored them in a fireproof safe she had installed the previous month. Then she updated her lawyer and requested that he begin drafting a full civil injunction, not just for harassment but for sustained personal targeting with intent to cause reputational damage. It was a slow process, but one she was now committed to seeing through. Karen had made it personal, but Cassandra had just made it procedural. And that made all the difference. The next time Karen passed her on the street, she said nothing. No smile, no insult, just a lingering look, as if she were waiting for Cassandra to break the silence, to flinch or speak or shatter the illusion of indifference. But Cassandra walked past her as though she were smoke, as though she no longer mattered, and maybe she didn't, because Cassandra wasn't defending herself anymore. She was preparing to end this, on her own terms, permanently. The weeks that followed were deceptively quiet, which for Cassandra was far more unsettling than direct confrontation. There were no notes, no strange packages, no flickering lights or manipulated systems. Her legal team moved forward with the civil injunction, submitting Cassandra's full documentation, and received acknowledgement of the court's receipt. Her case was moving slowly through the queue, tangled with dozens of other civil filings. But the attorney assured her it was only a matter of time before the motion for protection would be heard. Cassandra maintained her vigilance. She wasn't naive enough to think silence meant surrender, especially not from someone like Karen. It meant calculation, preparation. It meant something was coming. It started again with the neighborhood itself. Cassandra noticed subtle shifts not just in Karen's behavior but in the way her other neighbors looked at her. The man across the street, who used to wave politely, now avoided eye contact. A woman who had once stopped to compliment Cassandra's flower beds now crossed to the other side of the street during her walks. Children who played near the cul-de-sac no longer came past her yard. None of it was dramatic, nothing overt, but the collective distance was impossible to ignore. Cassandra could feel the shift in temperature every time she stepped outside. She didn't need confirmation to know that Karen had begun whispering again. That suspicion was confirmed when a neighbor's dog escaped its yard and wandered into Cassandra's garden. Cassandra calmly walked the golden retriever back to its gate, knocked, and handed him off to the owner, a man in his early 40s with a tight smile and nervous hands. "Thanks," he muttered, taking the leash. "Appreciate it." Cassandra nodded and turned to leave, but the man hesitated. "Look, I probably shouldn't say anything," he added, lowering his voice, "but I think Karen's been telling people things. About you. About the situation." Cassandra turned back slowly, meeting his eyes without a word. He looked away. "Just weird stuff. That you've been acting unstable. That there's been police reports. That you're bringing tension into the neighborhood." Cassandra didn't flinch. She simply said, "And you believe her?" The man shook his head. "I didn't say that. I just think you should know what's going around." The next morning, a complaint was filed with the city sanitation department alleging that Cassandra's compost bins were producing a pungent, offensive odor detectable from adjacent properties. The inspector who arrived was apologetic and embarrassed, clearly sent out on protocol rather than necessity. He found nothing, made polite conversation, and confirmed that the bins met all regulations. "I have to log it anyway," he said with a shrug. "But you're fine." Honestly, it feels like someone just wanted to create a little trouble. Cassandra thanked him, watched his truck disappear down the road, and went back inside. That same afternoon, she received an anonymous letter in her mailbox, this one printed on glossy cardstock, with bold black letters. "Community matters. No one is above the standard." There was no signature, no return address. Just the sentence, centered like a slogan. Cassandra didn't show anger. She didn't react visibly. She simply updated her legal log and uploaded photos of the letter to her secure case file. She also ordered a discrete external microphone array to supplement her security system, one that would allow for directional sound capture within a set range, legal for private property use, and invisible to casual observation. Karen was working through influence now, trying to isolate Cassandra, turn public perception against her, using soft power to suffocate her presence in the community. Cassandra's strength had always been in precision, and now she was applying it the same way she once handled internal investigations in her former corporate life. Fact over feeling, strategy over sentiment, method over impulse. But Karen escalated again, this time with a move that was as reckless as it was desperate. Cassandra returned from a grocery run one afternoon to find her garage door half open, its internal mechanism whining in protest. The outer keypad had been tampered with, keys scratched, the faceplate cracked. Cassandra's breath slowed as she stepped forward, hand already on her phone, and called the police before even entering. When the responding officer arrived, they found that nothing had been taken. No forced entry beyond the keypad, no evidence of a break-in. But the implication was obvious: someone had tried to gain access. Someone who knew the system well enough to target a weak point. Cassandra filed another report. The officer made no promises but noted that if these incidents continue, we'll recommend patrol frequency increase in this area. 2 nights later, a car alarm blared at 3:22 a.m. Cassandra jolted awake, heart already racing, and looked out her window. Her car was fine. The sound came from the neighbor's driveway. She stepped onto her porch cautiously, phone in hand, scanning the area. That's when she saw it across the street. Karen stood barefoot in her driveway, arms crossed, eyes locked on Cassandra. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stared, motionless, lit by the rhythmic strobing of the alarm's flash. After 30 seconds, she turned and walked back inside. The car alarm stopped. The silence returned. The next day, Cassandra received a subpoena not from the court, but from a private firm hired by Karen's legal counsel. The letter stated that Cassandra was being accused of defamation, reputational damage, and deliberate harassment. Karen had filed a counterclaim in response to Cassandra's injunction. The document was riddled with half-truths and manipulations, references to Cassandra's unreasonable hostility, disruptive tendencies, and an ongoing campaign of surveillance and intimidation. She even claimed emotional distress, citing sleepless nights, anxiety, and fear for personal safety. Cassandra's lawyer wasn't surprised. "This is a strategy to neutralize your case," he explained. "She's trying to force a stalemate, muddy the waters. But she's overreaching. If she makes this public, we can expose her pattern." Cassandra nodded, her jaw tight. "I'm not backing down." He paused. "You might need to consider public testimony, affidavits from neighbors, maybe even go on record with a formal deposition." Cassandra knew the implication. It would mean visibility. It would mean stepping into the light when she had spent years cultivating silence and privacy. But she also knew there was no other way. Karen wasn't going to stop. Not unless Cassandra made her stop. That evening, Cassandra received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thought you'd want to see this." The body of the email was empty, except for a single image attachment. She opened it, and her blood turned to ice. It was a photo of her bedroom taken from the outside through the corner of the window where the curtain had been slightly open. The angle was recent. She could tell by the book on the nightstand, the water glass, the folded cardigan. Whoever had taken it had done so within the last 48 hours. She closed the email, forwarded it to her attorney, then shut her laptop with a calm, deliberate motion. This was no longer harassment. This was a threat. A declaration. Karen was willing to blur the lines between passive interference and criminal surveillance. Cassandra didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room, lights off, security feeds open, eyes trained on the monitor. She waited, not because she expected Karen to appear, but because she knew eventually she would. Whether by proxy or by hand, Karen always returned to the scene, always sought control. The next morning, Cassandra called a private investigator. Not for surveillance, for containment. She didn't want to know what Karen was doing. She wanted her stopped legally, permanently, without ambiguity. The PI, a blunt woman with military posture and a resume to match, listened without interruption. When Cassandra finished, the woman simply said, "I've dealt with worse. But this one's clever. You'll need patience and a long view." Cassandra nodded. "I've got both." And she did. Because this wasn't the end. It was a Tuesday evening, overcast, windless, unnervingly still. Cassandra returned home from a late meeting with her attorney and noticed immediately that something was off. The sensor light at the side entrance had been triggered and left on. Normally it shut off after 40 seconds. This time it had remained lit, casting a sterile square of light across the walkway, unmoving. She walked slowly, carefully, eyes scanning for movement, her hand wrapped around the smooth grip of the high-powered flashlight in her pocket. The lock on the side gate was intact, no signs of forced entry, but as she moved toward the rear of the house, a shape caught her eye near the base of the porch, small, metallic, foreign. She crouched without touching it, and saw it was a scorched lighter. Burnt on one side, the wheel melted slightly. Someone had dropped it in a hurry. The grass nearby was flattened in irregular patches, and the faint smell of accelerant, subtle but unmistakable, clung to the air. She didn't go inside. Instead, she walked back to her car, got in, locked the doors, and called the non-emergency line. Her voice was steady as she explained what she'd found, that she suspected a recent attempted arson, and that it was likely connected to an ongoing harassment and legal matter already on record. The dispatcher said a patrol unit would be dispatched shortly. Cassandra remained in her car with the interior lights off, engine running low, observing everything through the side mirrors. It took 11 minutes before the cruiser rolled up, lights muted, 2 officers stepping out, cautious but calm. She directed them to the side yard. They examined the lighter, took statements, logged the scene, and began canvassing the perimeter for further evidence. That's when one of them stopped near the back window, pointed out a strange residue just below the window frame. A faint, blackened streak, smudged but clearly the remnant of attempted ignition. Cassandra stood behind them as they photographed everything and listened as they agreed, quietly, that this wasn't just a prank. Someone had tried to light the back of the house. They couldn't confirm who, of course, not without direct evidence. But the pattern was too consistent, too carefully escalated, and now it had stepped over the final line. Cassandra didn't sleep that night. She remained on the couch, eyes on the monitor, heart steady, every corner of the house covered, motion sensors armed, audio monitoring calibrated. But the true shift didn't come until the following day, when the fire inspector arrived to follow up. He was in his late 50s, serious but courteous, and after completing a walkthrough of the yard and reviewing the materials Cassandra provided, he offered her a look that was not pity, but quiet understanding. "Whoever did this knew how to start a fire," he said plainly. But they weren't professionals. They tried to ignite without windproofing the area. That means they were impatient. That's good for us, because people like that always make mistakes. And make one she did. 2 days later, Cassandra's security system recorded motion at 4:12 a.m. She didn't hear it at first, had fallen into the first true sleep she'd had in weeks, but the remote alert triggered a vibration on her phone, and she opened the live feed with practiced precision. There, walking along the tree line at the edge of her property, was Karen. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't masked. She wore a dark hoodie, carried nothing, and moved with the slow deliberation of someone trying to blend into the dark. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Cassandra's new cameras were heat-sensitive, with low-light enhancement and automatic recognition mapping. The system tracked her movement, locked her image, and uploaded the file in real time to Cassandra's off-site drive. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She waited. Karen walked the perimeter once, paused at the back porch steps, then slowly turned and walked back into the woods. No interaction. No property damage. Just presence. And that was enough. The next morning, Cassandra forwarded the footage to her lawyer and the investigator. Within hours, the investigator contacted her. They'd run Karen's movements against other incidents in the neighborhood. They discovered she had also been recorded near another home 3 blocks down, home of a couple that had recently installed a new porch light. One that Karen had previously complained about being too harsh. A pattern had emerged, not just harassment, but a wider net of manipulation, targeting anyone who disrupted the aesthetic she believed she controlled. That afternoon, Cassandra received a court date. The civil harassment hearing was approved. The judge had reviewed the submitted materials and determined there was sufficient cause to proceed. It was scheduled for the following week. Cassandra prepared herself quietly, documents arranged, witnesses contacted, footage secured, legal statements notarized. The PI delivered a final folder of compiled records, including statements from 2 other neighbors who had experienced similar, though less intense, intimidation from Karen. One of them admitted they had moved out early because of her. The other offered to testify. But Karen wasn't finished. 2 days before the hearing, a delivery van pulled into Cassandra's driveway unmarked, unexpected. The driver exited quickly, dropped a flat package at her doorstep, and drove off before she could even reach the front door. Inside the package was a framed photograph, one she'd never seen, taken from inside her home, clearly shot through the front window at night. The frame was cheap wood, the kind you buy in bulk. Behind it, a note taped directly to the back: "We both know you don't belong here. You're just a visitor. I'm the one who stays." Cassandra stared at it for a full minute before placing the frame on the floor, photographing it, and sliding it into an evidence envelope. She didn't feel fear anymore. What she felt was the solid click of confirmation. This was over for Karen, she just didn't know it yet. The morning of the hearing arrived under gray skies. Cassandra dressed plainly, her manner composed, her materials precise. Her lawyer met her at the courthouse, flanked by the PI and 2 neighbors prepared to give testimony. Karen arrived alone, late, dressed too casually, and without her usual performance polish. Her face looked tight, drawn. Her eyes moved too quickly. When the judge entered, the room settled. And when Cassandra stood and calmly laid out her case with photos, timestamps, signed declarations, and professionally compiled records, it wasn't drama that filled the courtroom. It was something far more damning: structure. Karen offered rebuttals, of course. Claimed Cassandra had exaggerated, had staged incidents, had a vendetta. But she had no evidence, no corroborating witness, nothing but implications and feigned confusion. Her voice began to tremble halfway through her statement, and for the first time her charm failed her. The judge didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The truth had already been laid bare. By the end of the day, the court granted Cassandra a full protection order. Karen was legally barred from contact, from proximity, from any digital or third-party communication. Violations would result in criminal charges. But that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the moment Cassandra stepped out of the courtroom and exhaled not in relief but in finality. She had not won because she shouted louder or played dirtier. She had won because she had refused to become what Karen tried to paint her as, and now Karen was left with silence. The kind that doesn't comfort, the kind that isolates. 3 months after the judge's injunction, the street looked the same, but everything had changed. The for sale signs were gone, the mysterious SUV stopped appearing, and the flyers in the mailbox returned to mundane coupons for carpet cleaning and 2-for-1 pizza. The tension that had once gripped the neighborhood had dissipated, replaced by a wary stillness, like a town recovering from a long siege. Sophie no longer woke up expecting a new threat. The mailbox no longer brought dread. The phone, when it rang, did so without causing her pulse to spike. Most importantly, Teddy was still in his home, still in his chair by the window, and though his days continued to swing between clarity and fog, the fear that had haunted his face during those worst weeks was gone. The fight was over, and they had won not through rage, not through spectacle, but through persistence, strategy, and refusing to be pushed quietly out of the way. The appeal had been dismissed. The state's ethics committee completed its review and issued a formal reprimand to the developer connected to the case, citing multiple breaches of transparency and failure to disclose conflicts of interest. Mulroy resigned from his position on the neighborhood committee and sold his home, quietly, without ceremony, to a private buyer who removed the security cameras and let the lawn grow wild for the first time in years. Several of the LLCs connected to the fraudulent transfers were dissolved in a single week, likely under legal pressure. EPS closed their investigation with a full written acknowledgement that Teddy's rights had been compromised and protections had failed him. The county recorded the reversal of the deed transfer, re-establishing Teddy Anderson as the sole and rightful owner of the property at 811 Lindale Street. No more caveats, no more asterisks, no more loopholes. Sophie requested and received a certified copy of the deed, framed it, and hung it above the fireplace, proof, visible and irrefutable, that the house belonged to the man who built it and the family who defended it. Dan Hurley refused payment for the final month of his work. He said he'd seen too many cases like this spiral into silence and wanted this one to be the one that stuck. Sophie sent him a bottle of good bourbon and a thank you card signed by Teddy in his still steady hand. Linda returned to Ohio but promised to come back every summer, and true to her word, the following June she arrived with a toolbox, a box of dusty photo albums, and a determination to repaint the porch swing. Sophie stayed. She turned down a remote position in Portland and instead took a community advocacy job in the same county where the battle had unfolded. She began working with a local task force that had emerged from the APS findings, helping design new procedural guidelines for property transactions involving vulnerable adults. She didn't want the spotlight. She didn't want revenge. She wanted safeguards, paper trails, waiting periods, required second signatures. Nothing radical, just accountability. The neighborhood changed slowly in response. More families started asking questions, getting involved, attending the dull zoning meetings that no one had ever bothered with before. A new community board formed, not appointed, but elected, and Sophie was asked to join. She declined, but she helped them draft their charter. She didn't need a title. She had her name on the mailbox, her grandfather in the living room, and her grandmother's rosebush still blooming stubbornly in the side yard. On a mild October afternoon, Sophie and Teddy sat on the back porch, watching the leaves drift down in slow, thoughtful spirals. He was lucid that day, alert and quieter than usual. He turned to her after a long silence and said, "You could have walked away. I wouldn't have blamed you." Sophie shook her head. "You never walked away from us. I wasn't about to start the trend." He smiled, his eyes wet but steady. "I don't remember everything, but I know you kept me here. Then... that..." She reached over, squeezed his hand, and said, "You were never leaving. You just forgot that for a little while." That night, she walked past the fireplace and paused in front of the framed deed. For the first time, it felt settled, not just legally but emotionally. The house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like what it had always been beneath the fear and paperwork: home,